Thanks, Tom. Thanks to the committee for having me here to talk about how in Minnesota waters we manage our commercial Cisco fishery. Minnesota waters of Lake Superior, they're 2,300 square miles. They make up about 7% of the total surface area of Lake Superior. Our shared border with Wisconsin stretches 111 miles. Our shared border with Michigan stretches about 50 miles. Our Minnesota data that we have on commercial fishing goes back to 1932 for the number of commercial fishermen peaked about 400. As fish stocks declined, so too did the number of commercial fishermen. Today in Minnesota statute, we cap the total number of commercial fishermen in Minnesota waters at 25. Our harvest data goes back to about 1913 for lake trout and Cisco, but prior to a lake trout and Cisco fishery, Minnesota actually had a valuable lake whitefish fishery. And I think it's neat and important for us to kind of go back and see what happened with that whitefish fishery. This is the second annual report of the Minnesota Game and Fish Commission, 1891, 1892. And Mr. Sweeney was the president of the Game and Fish Commission at the time, and he was writing to the governor of Minnesota, and he states in there, formerly along Minnesota coast where lake whitefish fishing had been great, exhaustive and destructive fishing methods have led to effort expanded closer to the Canadian border where Canada has commercial fishing closure during the spawning season for lake whitefish. I believe lake trout and Cisco at the same time. He continues on to the governor that it's very apparent to our commercial fishermen themselves that a spawning closure is a great idea and it should be instituted, and it would help for this is 1891 again. This would help for the sustainability, the long term of the fishery, but they also say that without the rule of law to make them not set nets, they will continue to set their nets. We did not, this is Mark Kurlansky in his book, Caught a Biography of the Fish That Changed the World. He summed up this relationship between government and fishermen very well, where he says fishermen rarely consider regulation their responsibility. As they see it, that is the duty of government to make the rules, and it is their duty to navigate through them. If the stocks are not conserved, government mismanagement is to blame. So rather than instituting meaningful regulations, Minnesota did not. And the commercial fishermen at the time were so concerned about lake whitefish extinction in Minnesota waters that they formed the Duluth Fishing Association. And what they did was they lobbied the U.S. Fish Commission at the time to build a federal fish hatchery in Minnesota. This is the Lester River Federal Fish Hatchery just north of Duluth, built in 1888. It stocked lake whitefish, lake trout, Cisco, brook trout, walleye, something called a Scotch salmon, whatever they could produce in stock they did. And it looked, in this, again, our second annual report in 1891, it looked like the hatchery might be the savior of the lake whitefish fishery. But unfortunately, sometime between when it was built in the late 1800s and the time that we have good harvest data in Minnesota, that lake whitefish fishery disappeared. And we're left with our lake trout and our Cisco fishery in Minnesota waters. This is a graph of 102 years of commercial fishing in Minnesota waters. And again, we see peak harvest in 1920s and 1930s for both lake trout and Cisco. Through time, those populations declined. The mid-1940s, two invasive species, rainbow smelt, sea lamprey. Mid-1950s in Minnesota was interesting. Reserve Mining Company came online. What Reserve Mining Company did was they built a processing plant in Silver Bay, Minnesota. And they dumped the equivalent of 2 train cars full of tailings or waste rock into Lake Superior every 2 minutes. This went on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 25 years. Commercial fishing was impacted, water quality impacted, water clarity impacted, spawning grounds impacted. All of this combined essentially led to almost destruction of lake trout and Cisco for that fact. And we get into this cool time period in the 1960s where the primary predator in lake trout has declined, primary planktivorm Cisco has declined, rainbow smelt had open niche and they boomed. Millions of pounds of commercial harvest. But as with any new species filling a niche, they also busted. And as lake trout recovery occurred in the Minnesota waters, lake trout suppressed and continue to suppress those smelt populations. And now we're really focusing on this time period from 1980 on. So again, why we're here, Joint Strategic Plan, page 11, kind of lays out the framework for managers to follow, in essence, on building fish community objectives and how we can all cooperatively manage these fisheries. The fish community objective for Cisco and Lake Superior is it's a prey species, a self-sustaining assemblage of prey dominated by indigenous species at population levels capable of supporting desired populations of predators and a managed commercial fishery. Further in there, management agencies are limited in what can be done to affect change in Lake Superior's prey fish populations. Essentially what we can do is limit the commercial harvest of lake herring to minimize mortality of populations. Minnesota has two markets for Cisco. We have the fillet market and we have the roe market. The fillet market, again, we don't have a lake whitefish fishery, so the fillet market is our fishery for the summer. It is a local market. The guys provide fillets to local restaurants, grocery stores, etc. The roe market, Jared described it very well. The commercial fishermen are targeting pre-spawn females for their roe. Looking at our harvest data in Minnesota waters, we see an increase again in the early 90s. We go through time. Minnesota reopened the fall fishery, I believe it was in 2005, and that's an interesting period as well because the guys that used to fish the fillet fishery, now when we open up a roe fishery where they're easier to catch, they don't have to set as much net, they don't have to stay out as long, and it's much more profitable. Guys shifted away from the fillet fishery into the roe fishery. So they changed their behavior. Again, we set the regulation, they navigate through it. Last couple of years, we see declines in both total harvest, fillet harvest, roe harvest, catch per unit efforts. Minnesota, we've seen lately a big push in the local food movement. And this is something that goes on every year. It's called a Salute to Lake Superior Sustainable Fisheries, where professional chefs get together. They make their best Cisco dishes. They get rated, graded. It's kind of a pretty big deal now. But this is always, in our office, in our management office, that we always ask the question, well, what's sustainable? And sustainability to who? You can get 5 different people with 5 different backgrounds and objectives into a room, and you would think that it'd be easy to agree on what the definition of sustainability is, but it's not. And what we're looking for in unsustainability is how do we know when things become unsustainable? We're pretty much looking for recruitment overfishing. Again, long-lived species are particularly vulnerable. Recruitment overfishing, stock is fish so heavy it doesn't have the reproductive capacity to replenish itself. So the way that we do it in Minnesota is we have fishery-dependent data and fishery-independent data. We rely on the USGS year class strength estimates from their spring bottom trawl surveys, which they've been doing since 1978 around the lake. I think we're all aware of the great efforts that they have. The number of age 1 Cisco that they catch in their bottom trawls is a good predictor of year class strength. Jared showed this again. 1984, huge year class, big year classes 88, 89, 90. Smaller year classes 98, 03, and 09. The last year class we've really had was in 09. A weak year class, about 10% of what the 03 year class was. So if we look at our harvest data again, we see that 1984 and those late 80s year classes, the fishery responded. Harvest and the fishery responded to that increase in biomass. Those year classes sustained the harvest for 10, almost 15 years. Until you get to 1998 year class, the 03 year class sustained it as well. But in the last couple of years, the lack of recruitment, relatively weak year classes, the amount of harvest going on, we see those declines in harvest and in our biomass estimates. Minnesota DNR also samples the commercial catch during the fillet fishery and the roe fishery, where we sample 300 fish along the entire shore, get otolith ages out of them, length, weight, sex, etc. This helps us to determine how much contribution each year class is giving to the fisheries. What we see is we overlay year classes for the fish that we sample. The left axis, number of Cisco sampled. Right axis is the relative density, the USGS year class strength indexes. And we see the USGS data does do a good job of predicting year classes. those fish that we age, we can put those back into a year class the USGS said was going to be there. What we see in our commercial fisheries, this is July 2013 from our fillet market. Essentially, we have 3 year classes providing to the commercial fisheries. We got the 98, the 03, and the 09. Again, the 09 year class being a relatively weak year class, and those previous 1998 and 03 year classes have been fished on for well over a decade now. We also know through all of our aging stuff that from the time it takes 4 years for Cisco to fully recruit to the commercial gear, and this becomes important in a little bit here. So looking at our November, our fillet data, or our roe market data, sorry, 3 year classes again, same year classes providing contribution to the fishery. One of the last things we do is we do our own DNR netting assessment in October. We also have a fairly thorough hydroacoustic midwater trawling program that we use to help us assist us in setting our total allowable catch for our November quota fishery. So if we look at all of, we looked at our fall commercial data, we looked at our spring or our fillet market data, looking at our DNR assessment, our fishery independent assessments, and our trawling that we do, 3 year classes again. It's kind of the same thing. There's only 3 year classes of fish that we're fishing off of. So with our hydroacoustics, we do our hydroacoustics surveys in August. We've been doing this since about 2001. Again, to set the total allowable catch for our November fishery. And it's all well and fine when you're getting biomass estimates up around 500,000 pounds. What we do when we're setting our total allowable catch is we estimate spawning stock biomass, and we take 10% of that based on Stockwell and others paper, right? 10 to 15% harvest is sustainable. But we also can put confidence interval estimates or confidence intervals around our biomass estimate. And to be a little more on the conservative side, we use the lower 95% confidence interval for our actual biomass estimate. We average 3 years together, so we're not seeing annual changes in quotas. And again, it works fine when you're up around 500,000 pounds. Guys are making money. There's enough quota to go around. What we've seen in the last 2 years is that fall by over 50%. 2014, our 3 year average for spawning stock biomass was right around 200,000 pounds. The way that we calculate out our quota, that we get to these final numbers. So we do our surveys in August, but it takes us a year to analyze the hydroacoustics data. So we're always running a year behind of where our biomass estimate is and where our total allowable catch quota is being instituted. So what we have to do is we have to account for those fish that have been taken out of the fishery through commercial fishing. So we have our biomass estimate again of about 200,000 pounds. We subtract 62,000 pounds from the 2014 fillet fishery. Because the total allowable catch quotas have to go out before November, we use the previous year's October harvest as a place setter. So we then take that 140,000 pounds left over, subtract the 2013 October numbers, and we're left with 55,000 pounds. We take that and we distribute that to each management zone based on surface area. To put it in perspective, the 2014 total quota was approximately equal to 1 week's harvest in MN3 back in 2012. This is the most recent data that we have. It's commercial samples from this past November 2014. 2 3/4 inch stretch mesh, about 300 individuals. No changes, same 3 year classes, no surprise, based on, again, the USGS bottom trawl surveys. One thing that we have found, again, in this aging thing is it takes 4 years for these fish to fully recruit to the commercial fishery. The last survey, the 2013 USGS survey, tells us there's no year classes coming. So we know we have, the amount of biomass that's out there now has to last us through at least 2018. Our commercial fishery has to get to 2018 before there's any additional biomass for us to harvest in Minnesota waters. So in summary, we use fishery independent data used to evaluate the status of the population. The year classes that are produced are very intermittent. We have 3 year classes contributing to both the fillet and the roe fishery. We use a conservative total allowable catch quota, again based on 10% of the lower 95% confidence interval for spawning stock biomass, which has declined greater than 50% in the past 2 years, which has led to reduced quotas, which if you're a fishery manager and you're reducing quotas, you know what that leads to. Again, no major biomass inputs until at least 2018, so the trajectory of our biomass estimates going out into 2018 isn't looking good. So with that, I'll take any questions you might have.